As everyone knows, on February 24, 2022, just hours after President Putin launched the military operation in Ukraine, Western governments have imposed comprehensive sanctions targeting the Russian Federation. The United States and the European Union have imposed a ban on oil and gas imports while also freezing part of the Kremlin's foreign exchange reserves and cut off a large number of Russian banks from the global financial system. However, up to now, President Putin has remained resolute in not conceding, despite the severe impacts on the country's economy. This reflects a reality. Over the past 20 years, the United States and the European Union have imposed hundreds of sanction programs targeting thousands of individuals, businesses, and economic sectors across most countries. These sanctions have proven effective against most economies, yet they still face significant challenges when applied to certain countries. Alongside Russia, North Korea is also a formidable adversary of the West. This country is considered stubborn for persistently pursuing its controversial nuclear weapons program, despite over 70 years of sanctions. So why do international sanctions fail to work on North Korea? Watch the video below to find out the answer. North Korea lacks support from major powers. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, commonly referred to simply as Korea or North Korea. This is a country in East Asia, located in the northern half of the Korean peninsula and bordered by South Korea to the south. Currently, this country is classified among the least developed nations, with a 2022 GDP of only $29 billion and a per capita income of just $1,115. That's only 3.4% of a South Korean. This is the consequence of years of sanctions, leading to a lack of investment, stagnant production, and severe food shortages. Due to a history of tension and hostility, the United States became the first country to impose sanctions on North Korea in the 1950s. The origin of this dispute dates back to the Inter-Korean War, when both countries stood on opposing sides of the conflict. After the ceasefire agreement was signed, the main points of contention still revolved around North Korea's nuclear weapons program, missile tests, and human rights issues. Similar to the joint military exercises conducted by the United States and South Korea. By the 1980s, the United States had tightened sanctions after North Korean spies carried out a series of bombings targeting South Korea. The incidents include the Rangoon bombing and the bombing of Korean Air Flight 858. From 1988 to 2008, the United States designated North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism and imposed additional sanctions on its government. The Washington administration has imposed a comprehensive trade embargo on Pyongyang and frozen all North Korean assets in the U.S. This country also strictly prohibits the import of any agricultural products containing raw materials originating from North Korea. At the same time, all export activities to this region are prohibited if the product contains more than 10% of input materials originating from the United States. After Chairman Kim Jong-il passed away on December 17, 2011, his son Kim Jong-un succeeded him as the leader of the country. On February 29, 2012, the Pyongyang government announced a temporary suspension of nuclear testing activities. At that time, the Washington administration responded by providing 240,000 tons of food aid to Pyongyang. This shows that the West has become more flexible in response to Pyongyang's demand for grain-based food aid. However, after North Korea conducted further ballistic missile tests in April 2012, the U.S. decided to halt food aid to the country. On February 11, 2013, the United States Geological Survey, USGS, recorded an earthquake with a magnitude of 5.1 on the Richter scale. This is considered the third underground nuclear test conducted by North Korea. This country also declared it a successful nuclear test, using a lighter warhead but with greater destructive power than before, though the precise yield has not been disclosed. In March 2013, after two U.S. stealth B-2 bombers flew over the Korean peninsula, leader Kim Jong-un voiced his protest. The country's missiles are ready to strike U.S. military bases in the Pacific region. Growing tensions have prompted Washington to swiftly deploy advanced missile defense systems to the Western Pacific region. Despite strong international opposition, Bin Duong still conducted nuclear tests in 2016 and 2017. This is seen as a threat to global security, sparking outrage from many countries worldwide. As a result, the United States did not have to act alone when imposing sanctions on North Korea. The United Nations Security Council and the European Union have adopted around 10 resolutions related to this country. They also imposed asset freezes on individuals and organizations listed in the designated sanctions list. Joint ventures with organizations prohibited or restricted from engaging in commercial trade of goods with North Korea are strictly forbidden. Japan has enacted a law prohibiting bilateral trade with North Korea, while also restricting the entry of its citizens and vessels into Japanese territory. At the same time, transfers exceeding a value of $880 are also prohibited. In 2022, they froze several assets, especially during this period. The government has imposed sanctions on 13 organizations and individuals involved in North Korea's missile and nuclear development program. Additionally, there are South Korea, Russia, Taiwan, Australia, Canada, and several other countries. And continue to impose individual sanctions against this nuclear-obsessed nation. The sanctions are not effective against North Korea. The imposed sanctions have left North Korea in a more difficult situation in accessing the global financial system and conducting business operations with other countries around the world. This should have put more pressure on the Pyongyang government. This country must change its behavior and comply with international obligations. However, all efforts to halt North Korea's nuclear and missile programs have ended in disastrous failure. And it also dashed hopes of bringing this reclusive nation back to the rhythm of everyday life. At the same time, North Korea's ballistic missile program continues to advance and grow more powerful. They also conducted a record-breaking series of weapons tests on an unprecedented scale, including intercontinental ballistic missiles designed to reach as far as the United States. And this is the answer to the stubbornness of a nation that turned the world against it. The North Korean political system operates on the principle of centralized power. Democratic dictatorship, led by the workers. While outside observers often view the country in the northern part of this peninsula as a totalitarian dictatorship, and pay special attention to the complex personal relationships of Kim Il-sung and his family members. The government of this country imposes strict restrictions on freedom of speech and closely monitors the lives of its citizens. For example, the government prevents citizens from accessing the global internet, restricts interactions with foreigners, and especially bans discussions on political issues. Thus, even when international sanctions weaken the economy and push people's lives into hardship, the formation of a revolution in North Korea remains an extremely difficult task. The people here seem to have been forged through generations in boundless loyalty to the government and the state. There is almost no opposition to the country's governing regulations. Thus, the plot to sow political division and exploit the people to pressure the Pyongyang government has completely failed. Even this backfires because instead of blaming domestic nuclear tests, the North Koreans believe that the West is deliberately pushing them into a corner. Many political activists also argue that the sanctions against North Korea are not solely aimed at halting its nuclear program, a threat to global security. It didn't stop there, it aimed for something far greater, to overthrow the entire regime. However, much like the case of Cuba, North Korea's leadership is equally adamant about not yielding to international pressure to relinquish power. Moreover, international sanctions targeting authoritarian regimes often only affect the lives of ordinary citizens, while the ruling elites rarely face direct consequences. Elites still have access to abundant goods thanks to the country. According to a United Nations report, the estimated cost of luxury goods for North Korean leader Kim Jong-un amounts to $600 million annually. Since North Korea and Western countries have grown too accustomed to each other's empty promises, reaching a future agreement is highly unlikely. Looking back at the six-party talks involving China, Japan, North Korea, South Korea, Russia, and the US, we can clearly see this. In 2003, when North Korea announced its withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the international community proposed multilateral negotiations involving 6 relevant parties. The goal of these talks was to resolve the issue through diplomatic means and reach a mutual agreement. The government of this country opposes the above procedure, arguing that the nuclear dispute is a bilateral issue between them and the US. Under pressure from neighboring countries and with China's active involvement, they agreed to hold a preliminary trilateral round of talks in Beijing in April 2003, attended by both China and the United States. Following this meeting, North Korea agreed to participate in the 6-party talks, with multiple rounds of negotiations held continuously over the following months. Reaction to Washington. By the third phase of the 5th round of negotiations in February 2007, the parties had reached a breakthrough agreement, leading to the US lifting all sanctions on North Korea's frozen assets on March 19, 2007. Afterward, they accepted all nuclear inspection requests from the United States. In response, the Bush administration removed the country from the terrorism blacklist. But by the end of August 2008, Pyongyang was suspected of having resumed nuclear activities at the Yongbyon facility. The reason is that Washington failed to uphold its commitments regarding military disarmament and aid provision as agreed upon. Since then, the country has banned all nuclear inspectors from accessing the John Beale site and continues to ramp up its production of nuclear warheads. Since then, the sanctions have only created a vicious cycle of negotiation and agreement, without achieving long-term effectiveness. Even as sanctions tighten, North Korea only intensifies its display of nuclear might. The Korean Central News Agency, KCNA, once stated that the Iraqi and Libyan governments' abandonment of their nuclear programs was a fatal mistake. Iraq's nuclear program was disrupted by the 1991 Gulf War, just as the country was on the verge of achieving a new breakthrough in nuclear weapons. By the end of 2003, Libya voluntarily terminated its nuclear development program after reaching an agreement with the United States and the United Kingdom. The notable point is that afterward, both countries were soon invaded and plunged into prolonged political instability. While Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein was executed, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi was also assassinated. From then on, North Korea has asserted that history has proven nuclear weapons to be the sharpest sword against invasion plots, and that only a powerful nation can endure. They concluded that the economic benefits of the Western proposed agreement were too insignificant compared to the value of nuclear weapons, and insufficient to create a breakthrough for the national economy. Stand confidently before a treasure worth $6 trillion. Predominantly mountainous surface lies a vast wealth of mineral resources, comprising over 200 different types and spread extensively across nearly 80% of the country. Although estimates of this country's mineral resource value have varied significantly over the years, the primary reasons are the confidential nature and difficulty in accessing information. However, according to estimates by the Korea National Mining Company, the value could reach up to $6 trillion, with reserves of approximately 21 million tons of zinc, 5 billion tons of iron, 7 billion tons of coal, 3 million tons of copper, 2 million tons of barite, 2,000 tons of gold, 100 billion tons of limestone, and 6 billion tons of marl. Before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, North Korea primarily mined and traded minerals with countries in the socialist bloc. But by the 1990s, the mining industry's image had severely deteriorated after decades of neglect, poor management, and a lack of investment in infrastructure development. Now, the country faces an even greater challenge as the United Nations imposes a complete ban on all commercial activities in the mining sector. However, multiple sources indicate that Kim Jong-un's regime is becoming increasingly sophisticated in finding ways to circumvent laws and evade sanctions. Contrary to the common belief that it is a completely isolated country, North Korea still maintains business operations in several Asian and Middle Eastern nations, and even in parts of Europe. Moreover, North Korea's abundant mineral resources have long been an attractive target for its neighboring countries. A few years ago, China invested approximately $10 billion in an infrastructure project near the border with North Korea, primarily aimed at facilitating the extraction of iron ore and rare earth mines in the region. In 2014, the Russian Federation proposed a plan to upgrade North Korea's railway system in exchange for mineral resource exploitation rights in the country. Russia has repeatedly called on the international community to ease sanctions against its neighboring country East Vietnam, while continuing to allow workers from this nation to stay and work, despite deportation demands from the United Nations. South Korea is also not falling behind, as it considers investing in North Korea's deteriorating infrastructure, particularly mining projects. This could be another strategic move by Kim Jong-un, using this trillion-dollar nuclear arsenal in pursuit of his goal to turn North Korea into a nuclear power. But perhaps that is a matter for another day, when their nuclear power is no longer enough to threaten the major powers. Amid sanctions imposed by many countries, Beijing has become Pyongyang's most crucial trade partner. Republic of China and the Democratic People. Currently, this is the only defense treaty that China and North Korea have signed with any other country. Over the years, China has consistently maintained an embassy in the capital Pyongyang and a consulate general in Chongqing City. North Korea has established an embassy in Beijing and a consulate general in Shenyang. Republic of China as the sole legitimate government representing the entire territory of China. At the same time, it denies the legitimacy of the so-called Republic of China, and firmly opposes any claims of Taiwan. Most of China's support stems from lax enforcement of sanctions. And most importantly, the country's economic boom has significantly boosted import demand, primarily for minerals, textiles, and labor. From 2000 to 2015, bilateral trade turnover increased more than tenfold, peaking at $6.86 billion in 2014. Beijing is the primary investor in North Korea's mining and metallurgy sectors, including steel, iron, copper, coal, and rare earth industries. Trade between China and North Korea also generates significant revenue for the provinces of Jilin and Liaoning, areas that have experienced industrial decline since the 1970s. In return, North Korea relies on China for food and fuel imports, especially after South Korea's Sunshine Policy ended in 2008. Although relations between the two countries saw a slight decline in 2017 due to China's support for sanctions against North Korea. But the situation improved just a year later, in 2018, when leader Kim Jong-un met with President Xi Jinping in Beijing. In July 2019, North Korea, along with 49 other countries, signed a letter supporting the protection of vocational education and training centers in Xinjiang, while also acknowledging China's notable achievements in the field of human rights in the region. In addition, this country also defended China's stance on the Hong Kong protests and supported the implementation of the national security law in the Special Administrative Region before the United Nations. In short, the current stalemate between North Korea and the international community stems from two fundamental misconceptions. While North Korea believes that its nuclear weapons program will ensure lasting security for the country, the international community once again affirms that economic sanctions will compel North Korea to abandon this program. The result was a series of failed agreements and negotiations that spanned many centuries. But ultimately, these sanctions also carry significant weight by sending a strong message and filling the remaining gap between hollow diplomatic rhetoric and bloody military interventions. Although it is impossible to persuade authoritarian leaders to change their policies. However, to a certain extent, sanctions still have the potential to deter uncontrolled actions that threaten global security. Hello everyone, and see you all in the upcoming videos.